As we approach the 2020 presidential elections and debate cycle, it is an appropriate time to uncover the little-known private corporation that superintends the debates and what loyalties this corporation possesses. The corporation in question is called the Commission on Presidential Debates. Quote, "The Commission on Presidential Debates, CPD, is a non-profit corporation established in 1987 under the joint sponsorship of the Democratic and Republican political parties in the United States. The CPD sponsors and produces debates for U.S. presidential and vice presidential candidates and undertakes research and educational activities relating to the debates. It has run all of the presidential debates held since 1988. The Commission's debates are sponsored by private contributions from foundations and corporations, as well as fees from hosting institutions. The Commission's exclusion of third-party candidates from the debates has been the subject of controversy and legal challenges." Unquote. So not only is the Commission the singular governing entity which formulates all topical aspects of the debates, it is also responsible for forbidding participation of candidates who are outside of the Democrat-Republican dialectic. As Noam Chomsky has rightly stated, quote, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum." Unquote. No dissenting opinions outside of liberal Americanism, either in its Democratic or Republican mode, can be tolerated. It is known that the Jesuits have been dedicated to pushing the American ideology since the mid-20th century, from the writings of John Courtney Murray, S.J., who is a leading advisor at the Jesuit-dominated Vatican II conference and who worked with the Catholic-controlled CIA to spread Americanism, the reason for which will become apparent by the end of this video. Murray, along with fellow Jesuit Vatican II advisor Henry de Lubac, both embraced what is called the indirect theory of papal power, laid out centuries earlier by Jesuit Robert Bellermine. Interestingly, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was influenced by Jesuit Bellarmine. According to the Italian Wikipedia page for Robert Bellarmine, quote, "In his essay De Laesis, Bellarmine expresses some principles which are at the basis of modern political institutions, such as equality, all men are equal, Chapter 7, or popular sovereignty, Chapter 6. They were included in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America by Thomas Jefferson, who owned and annotated a book in which Bellarmine's claims were reported and contested." Unquote. Theories of papal power concern the way in which the Pope exercises and maintains universal temporal power, meaning world governance. The original view of papal power, also championed by Jesuits like Emmanuel Sa, Luis Molina, and Alphonse Salmeron, was the direct power theory, where the Pope had unlimited ability to depose kings, which view was expressed in the regicide doctrines of those Jesuits, and which led to the assassinations of various monarchs. Bellarmine indeed supported the right of the Pope to overthrow monarchs, the deposing power, which was a core part of the theory of direct power. In fact, John Courtney Murray even admitted Bellarmine's indirect theory of power denies the autonomy of states. So both Murray and de Lubac were compelled to criticize Bellarmine because under Bellarmine's conception of indirect power, the Church still had the right to depose kings. Surely this was seen by modern Jesuits as a concession of the fact that the papacy still sought dominion over the earth. The temporal power doctrine was given too much visibility in the face of secularism, especially with more and more American Catholics getting high political offices. So Murray and de Lubac ended up settling on Dominican monk John of Paris's theory of papal power, also an indirect theory. The main difference between Bellarmine's model and the model of John of Paris regarded the group which holds political power in a given territory not directly under the political jurisdiction of the Pope, as in the Papal States or modern Vatican City. Bellarmine's theory held that the princes presided in political affairs, while John of Paris's theory maintained that the collective of people within a territory possessed political power. Instead of the prince being instructed by the priests, now the politicians and government officials are. That is really the only difference, and by making this distinction, it is ludicrously claimed that the autonomy of the state is preserved because now the people rule themselves under their own consciences, but of course their consciences are under the spell of Roman priests. Here's the relevant summary from History and Contemporary Issues, Studies in Moral Theology by Charles E. Curran, an American Roman Catholic priest and moral theologian. Starting on page 88, quote, Murray strongly agrees in principle with the indirect power theory of John of Paris. The theologian succeeded in proposing a theory that recognizes the primacy of the Church but keeps the autonomy of the temporal intact. He insists that the state is a natural institution for human and temporal ends, and the unity of the Church is supernatural, with its power being exclusively spiritual. The state and the power of the prince are not mediated by the Church, but are of divine origin, since the state is an exigence of human nature independent of both sin and grace. The civil prince is not the instrument of the Church for the ends or purposes of the Church. Murray understands John of Paris to hold that the civil power is subordinate to the spiritual power in the sense that the whole order of the terrestrial is subordinate to the order of the transcendent spiritual destiny to which the Church guides us. The primacy of the spiritual does not involve a feudal lordship, but a spiritual reign respectful of all human freedoms in the temporal order. The normal and ordinary exercise of the primacy of the spiritual concerns the right of the Church to teach princes to rule their political activity by the norms of Christian justice. The Church does not teach the prince his politics. Here the power of the Church is magisterial, terminating at conscience and its Christian formation, an action that is truly spiritual in nature but indirectly may and should have effects in the temporal order. Our Jesuit theologian applies the basic theory of the indirect power of the Church to the changed conditions of political life today. The agent and bearer of the political power is no longer the Christian prince. The relationship today does not involve sacerdotum, the Church, and the regnum, the prince. Today, in the midst of democratic principles, the relationship involves the Church, sacerdotum, and the human person who is citizen and Christian, civis idem et Christianus. The Church instructs and forms the conscience of the citizen, who is free then to conform the life of the city to her conscience. The spiritual power of the Church is directed at the conscience of the believer, who is also a citizen and is free to bring her conscientious beliefs to bear on the life and structures of the temporal sphere. The action of the Church is purely spiritual and indirectly affects the temporal order through the person who is both citizen and Christian. The principle of freedom brings together the freedom of the Church and the freedom of the citizen. Murray directly and explicitly makes the link between John of Paris and Pope Pius XI's theory of Catholic action. Pius XI sees the layperson as the mediator between the Church and the temporal world and the way in which the Church ultimately touches the temporal. Thus, the theory of the indirect power of the Church espoused by John of Paris continues to have validity today because the spiritual power of the Church touches conscience and indirectly reaches the temporal order through the mediation of the conscience no longer of the prince but of the democratic citizen." Unquote. As was just read, Pius XI, who was pope a few decades after the fall of the Papal States, supported the indirect theory of papal power and put it into practice via lay political organization Catholic Action. This development is expanded on by Catholic scholar Stefania Tutino, a professor at UCLA, who admits universal temporal power as applied in Italy was implemented under the guise of the indirect banner starting with the papacy of Pius XI. Tutino, however, claims it was Bellarmine's brand of the indirect theory that was implemented by Pius, thus further blurring any practical distinction between John of Paris' theory and Bellarmine's with regard to imposing the will of the Church. Tutino agrees with the founder of Italian communism, Antonio Gramsci, who died a Catholic, when Gramsci plainly acknowledged that the Jesuits were seeking to dominate society and the state through this subterfuge of indirect power, and that during the early 1900s, Catholicism used a strategy of infiltration to penetrate the state with its permission and at the expense of its sovereignty. We read from Empire of Souls, Robert Bellermine in the Christian Commonwealth, pages 287 to 290 by Stefania Tutino, Oxford University Press, 2010. Quote, "The Italian Catholic Church, led by Pius XI, did not waste any time in taking advantage of this new form of sovereignty over the state, which was exercised with the state's very blessing, through the development of different means to create consensus and solidify hegemony. For instance, the Catholic school system, according to Gramsci, was a perfect institution in this respect because it was intrinsically democratic in a paternalistic way, as Gramsci specifies, and as such it was able to form, shape, and educate people of different socioeconomic means, including lower classes traditionally excluded by lay higher education institutions. Another means by which the Catholic Church in the 1930s developed its hegemonic potential was through associations such as Azione Cattolica, which Gramsci argued had been supported and strengthened by Pius XI as a means to spread Catholic values and culture throughout Italian society and not just within the clergy. The scenario that Gramsci is describing here is no less than Bellarmine's dream come true. Bellarmine's potestas indirecta was elaborated precisely to make the sovereignty of the Pope both superior to and different from the kind of sovereignty that could be exercised by a temporal ruler. What Gramsci defined as hegemonic strategies that Catholicism implemented during the first decades of the 1900s to penetrate the state with the state's permission, but at the expense of the state's own sovereignty, was precisely the kind of relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that Bellarmine had in mind, and for the defense of which Bellarmine suggested those profound changes in the ecclesiological, theological, and political identity of Catholicism that Bellarmine thought could ensure its monopoly against both Protestant churches and early modern states. I am not the first one to note this analogy. In fact, both Gramsci and Pius XI noted it too. At the end of the paragraph in the Quaderni in which he described the Catholic educational system and the Azione Cattolica, Gramsci wrote that those were ways in which the Catholic Church did not limit itself to creating priests, but also elaborated instruments with which it wanted to permeate the state. Remember the theory of indirect government elaborated by Bellarmine. In another passage of the Quaderni, dedicated to Agostino Gemelli, founder of the Università Cattolica, that is, one of the most prestigious and influential Catholic higher education institutions, Gramsci suggested that Gemelli's insistence on pure Thomism, a Thomism that did not seek any compromise with either positivism or idealism, as the basis of the university curriculum, was linked with the Concordato and with the exceptional position of monopoly that the Catholics can obtain in Italy in the world of the high official and scholastic culture, given their possibility of concentration of intellectual forces. This hypothesis, Gramsci wrote, was substantiated by the fact that Gemelli was not interested in speculative philosophy, since, in his own heart, Gemelli could not care less about any philosophy. Instead, his interests are purely practical, aimed at the conquest of the cultural market on the part of Catholicism. His activity is aimed at ensuring the Vatican that indirect power over society and state, which is the essential strategic end of the Jesuits, and which was theorized by their current saint, Robert Bellarmine. Gramsci's reference to Bellarmine as a current saint is not incidental because Bellarmine was canonized precisely in 1930 and precisely by Pius XI. Gramsci was quick in understanding the implication of such timing. As he wrote in a fragment from the Quaderni, The fact that Pius XI had praised Bellarmine, whom Gramsci defined as the greatest Jesuit authority after Loyola, so much the Pope declared him blessed in 1923, saint in 1930, and doctor of the Church in 1931, suggested that Pius XI, who has been called the Pope of the Missions and the Pope of the Azione Cattolica, must be especially called the Pope of the Jesuits. Later in the same text, Gramsci remarked that the Jesuits today see in the canonization in the inclusion of Bellarmine among the doctors of the Church a revenge. Thus, Gramsci noted that Pius XI's canonization of Bellarmine was part of a larger strategy, or better, represented a clear indication that Pius had decided to follow Bellarmine's strategy of indirect power, which is why Gramsci noted the Pope's support of missions of the Azione Cattolica as part of the same trajectory that brought about Bellarmine's canonization. Moreover, Gramsci's remark that Bellarmine's canonization was seen as a revenge by the Society of Jesus suggests, as I've already argued, Gramsci's intuition that Bellarmine's theory had more to do with the 1930s papacy than with Counter-Reformation papacy, which had in fact opposed Bellarmine's canonization. In another fragment, Gramsci wrote somewhat hastily, "Canonization of Robert Bellarmine, sign of the times and of the supposed impulse of the new power for the Catholic Church, strengthening of the Jesuits, etc." Bellarmine conducted the trial against Galileo and wrote the 8 reasons that brought Giordano Bruno to the stake. He was canonized on the 29th of June 1930, but what is important is not this date, but the date in which the process of canonization began. Bellarmine is the author of the formula of the potere indiretto of the Church over all civil sovereignty. The Feast of Christ the King, instituted in 1925 or 26 on the last Sunday of October every year. In this fragment, Gramsci once again linked the revival of Bellarmine with the specific political and religious circumstances of the 1920s and 1930s. Gramsci hinted at the linkage when he noted the chronological link between Bellarmine's canonization and the institution of the Feast of Christ the King. Also, Gramsci noted again that Bellarmine was ahead of his time. Bellarmine's canonization process began in 1627. The fact that it took the papacy 3 centuries to complete it suggests how far Bellarmine's theory was from the intellectual and political horizon of the Counter-Reformation Catholicism, and how close instead it was to Pius XI's vision. Also interesting is Gramsci's mention of Bellarmine's role in the condemnations of Galileo and Bruno, who for Gramsci represented the Italian Renaissance that failed to mobilize the masses. In a sense, Bellarmine's condemnation of those Renaissance intellectuals contributed to eliminate the infecund Italian Reformation, which was sacrificed not only on the altar of the failed political project of Counter-Reformation Catholicism, but also on the altar of the other inherently Bellarminian project to strengthen the papacy as a hegemonic force. This later project came to fruition 3 centuries after Bruno's and Galileo's condemnations. In sum, Bellarmine's intuition regarding the immense political, theological, and intellectual potential of the papacy's supernatural spiritual sovereignty did not burn, together with the Counter-Reformation model of universal papal monarchy, on the pyre of the 30 Years' War. Indeed, if we believe that the novelty and originality of Bellarmine's theory lie in the fact that it identified and developed a kind of sovereignty that manifested itself aside from and beyond direct political coercion, or, in Gramscian terms, in the fact that it identified the future of Catholicism as a hegemonic force that worked within and above the state, then Bellarmine's theory started to really come to life in the 1930s, unquote. Even more explicitly, in 1959, Dutch Jesuit Louis Paulussen made known to the New York Times the Jesuit papacy's ambition to use lay Catholics in order to form a world federation. The sentiments expressed by Jesuit Louis Paulussen to the Sodality Congress, representing at the time 8 million lay Catholics, align precisely with this indirect power stratagem taken up by Vatican II Jesuits. The article reads as follows, quote, World Unity Held Catholic Goal by Leader of Sodality Congress. Roman Catholic lay leaders have a task in developing a world government far stronger than any federation that has existed in the past, the International Director of the Secretariat of World Sodalities said yesterday. The director, Reverend Louis Paulus,n arrived in the United States from Rome last Sunday to supervise the preparations for the Second World Congress of Sodalities of Our Lady. The meeting will be held at Seton Hall University, South Orange, New Jersey, August 20th to 23rd. One practical result of the Congress, he said at a news interview here, should be strengthening of the supranatural-minded spirit among Catholic laymen who attend. The spirit of Catholics is much stronger than the national spirit, Father Paulus,n said. A new world is in the making, and it will be one world. The church concept of the mystical body of Christ is the idea of world federation. Indirectly, he said the sodalities, which are local organizations of 8 million lay leaders over the world, back world government by making alive in Catholics a feeling for world federation. Unquote. Catholic Action's modus operandi, as seen, was to take control of the state for the Church through the universities and intellectual sphere. The network of 28 Jesuit universities in America, chief of which is Georgetown University, along with the rest of the 197 Catholic colleges and universities in America, in conjunction with the Knights of Columbus, Knights of Malta, and other Catholic organizations like the Ignatian, Jesuit-founded World Sodalities, now called Christian Life Communities, is equivalent to the one which Catholic action groups were operating in Italy to ensure papal dominion over the Savoyard regime, the fascist regime of Mussolini, and the Italian Republic. The Catholic Action model was the Jesuit Vatican's blueprint for political domination to be exported to the rest of the world. Christopher Denny's contribution to the book Empowering the People of God, Catholic Action Before and After Vatican II, Catholic Practice in North America, published on Fordham University Press, shows that John Courtney Murray promoted the Catholic Action infiltration model within the American ideological program he was helping to spread. The abstract of Denny's article titled From Participation to Community, John Courtney Murray's American Justification for Catholic Action, explains, quote, "This theological survey helps to explain to the readers of this volume the intellectual justifications that America's most influential theologian used to defend a more activist stance for the lay apostolate, providing support for religious developments that would eventually outgrow the original goals of the Catholic Action movement and spill over into what Vatican II's Lumen Gentium called the people of God," unquote. One instance of this so-called indirect theory of papal power lies at the heart of the American political spectacle, the presidential debates. The Jesuit papacy already controls the American Congress and thus the Democrat and Republican parties. So naturally, the debate commission only allows candidates within those parties to debate. That is because the Commission of Presidential Debates is controlled by a devout Catholic Knight of Malta, Frank J. Fahrenkopf, Jr. Frank J. Fahrenkopf Jr. is a Knight of Malta and was the master of the casino gambling industry, having been the president and the CEO of the American Gaming Association since its inception until his retirement in 2013. Fahrenkopf was chairman of the Republican National Committee longer than any person in the 20th century, and he co-founded the Commission on Presidential Debates together with another Roman Catholic, Paul G. Kirk, who was Fahrenkopf's counterpart as head of the Democratic National Committee. Fahrenkopf has been a professor at Jesuit Georgetown University, and he was a founder of the National Endowment for Democracy, where he served as vice chairman and a board member from 1983 to 1993. Co-chairing the commission with Fahrenkopf is Kenneth Wallach, who, at the 10th anniversary of Georgetown University's master's program in democracy and governance, cited Jesuit Georgetown University as pioneering work in the field. We see the Jesuits have devoted entire programs at their universities for spreading democratic systems of government, which, when implemented, are able to be co-opted by the Catholic laity. this being in accordance with the indirect theory of temporal power and the Catholic action/Lumen Gentium model. To top it off, sitting on the board of directors for the Commission of Presidential Debates is Reverend John L. Jenkins, a Catholic priest and president of the University of Notre Dame, Jesuit trained from Santa Clara University.